We go. Welcome everybody to Judaism 201 for the first of a two-parter on Chanukah, the last pit stop before the darkness, before Galus. As I mentioned in the promotional materials, this is not your typical Chanukah is about the forces of light and spirituality overcoming forces of Gashmias and the Greeks. Which is Chanukah on a slightly deeper level. But this is Judaism 201 series, and we've all heard that a number of times before. I wanted to take it to a whole nother level. So that's what we're going to do. So first, I want to start off. I had a little bit of a teaser in the promotional materials, which actually has nothing to do with the actual shiur, but I thought it was a very interesting thing about Chanukah. And that is that, and somebody asked about that last week. I mentioned that some say that Hanukkah is the oldest holiday in the world. So the obvious question is, how can that be? Because Hanukkah happened after the Torah. I'm going to do a share screen here and bring up. Here we go. This is a passage from Avodah Zarah. I'm not going to just read the whole passage, but I do want to, I'll talk about this passage. It talks about, so Adam Harishon, if we remember the situation, he and Chava did the sin of eating from the tree, and they expected that they were going to die. So now it's been a month or 2 months or 3 months, and he hasn't died. So he has that in the back of his mind. And what he starts to notice after a month or two is that the days are getting shorter and shorter. And he figured, oh, okay, so this is how I'm going to die. If you look in the third line of the Hebrew here, I'm going to try to, and he figures, v'chozer l'tohu v'vohu. He figures, okay, so maybe this is how I'm going to die. The universe is going to go back to tohu v'vohu, which is the state of creation. You might recall that from a pasuk at the very first part of Sefer Bereshis, that the world was tohu v'vohu, right? Void and disorder and chaos before, and this was even before Hashem said, let there be light. So he figured, okay, well, this is how it happens. So he spent 8 days. He created an 8-day observance upon himself, and he spent it in fasting and prayer. And then shortly after that was the winter solstice. And after a couple days, he started realizing that the days were now getting longer. And he was very happy. And he then observed an 8-day festival. And you can look in the Hebrew here, Shmona Yamim Tovim Lashana, that he, here we go, Va'ase Shmona Yamim. So he made for himself an 8-day Yontif. And he observed the festival for 8 days. And then, as the Gemara goes on to say, that he began to, that every year after that, he established those holidays for subsequent years. So he would have an 8-day festival right before the solstice, or not an 8-day festival, an 8-day period of, introspection and fasting, and then an 8-day period afterwards for of celebration. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And the Gemara goes on to say, or actually, technically it introduces this passage by noting that there are 2 holidays at the time of the Gemara that were very common that followed this pattern. And you may have heard of the holidays. So one is Saturnalia. The one that occurred before the solstice was called Saturnalia, and the one that was afterwards, the 8-day Yom Tov that Adam Rishon invented, was called Kalenda. And actually, those 8 days were December 25th through January 1st, which may ring a bell on the secular calendar. And also, the word calendar comes from the word kalenda. So, what the Gemara is suggesting is that the whole idea of having that every culture has celebrations around or observances of some sort around the time of the winter solstice, and that this was the source of it. And obviously, there's a connection of an 8-day Yontif to an 8 days of Chanukah here, and that brings to mind Rambam's explanation of how Avodah Zarah came to be in the world. It seems sort of strange at first if you think about it. We do not have the view, classical Judaism does not have the view that, everybody was a pagan, and then, we figured out that, Avram Avinu figured out that there was one God, and that he invented monotheism because Adam Rishon and Chava talked to Hashem. So there was knowledge of God before then. What happened between Adam and Chava and Avram Avinu, Avram and Sarah? So the Rambam actually explains it in his Mishnah Torah, in his book of Halacha. He says at first everybody understood that there was one God and people worshiped God. And then afterwards, after a period of time, some people started wondering, not wondering, but they thought to themselves, the sun and the moon are really important. And God created the sun and the moon, so we should show appreciation to the sun and the moon also. And while we're at it, we should, appreciate other things of nature, maybe other stars. So originally it was in good intent. The idea was to celebrate the other aspects of Hashem's creation. And the Rambam says that eventually what happened is they started worshiping those things as entities for themselves, entities in and of themselves. And that's how paganism and Avodah Zarah started. So too here. So we have holidays that were created around the winter solstice for the highest reasons. And what the Talmud's suggesting is that, over time, other cultures co-opted these holidays, forgot what the original purpose was, and made their own holidays at it. All right, so that was sort of a tease, which has nothing to do with the presentation, but I thought it was very interesting that Adam Rishon celebrated a proto-Chanukah, so to speak. All right, so now I'd like to start the main part of my presentation, which is what we're going to look at today and next week. By way of introduction, we know that every holiday has many components to it. They have theological components, there are moral components, and we don't quite look at it so much, but there's also national historical components. I'm going to use a lot of analogies during this presentation so that we can get a handle on things. So let me take Pesach for an example. So Pesach, the theological component, is that this is really the first time that Hashem jumps into history in such a public way and displays the tenets of monotheism through the prism of Egyptian culture. Hashem intervenes in history is one of the theological underpinnings. It's one of the 13 Ikari Emunah, I think. Hashem intervenes in history. Hashem is involved in our lives. So that's the theological message of Pesach. The real easy part is the moral message of Pesach. Slavery is not a good thing. It's etc. That's easy. The national historical part of Pesach is also extremely important because really it's the birth of a nation. The birth of Bnei Israel starts with starts with the Exodus. We know that right before, um, hold on one second, sorry. We know that right before um, the Bnei Israel were taken out, Bnei Israel got the very first mitzvah as a nation, as a group, and that first mitzvah is Kiddush HaChodesh, to sanctify the moon. So this really is the birth of a nation. The other important factor to understand is that Hashem decided that this could have been done at any point, but Hashem picked the specific time and place for when Yetzias Mitzrayim should occur. So this idea that every holiday has a theological component, a moral component, and a national historical component not only applies to biblical holidays, but it's also true of the rabbinical holidays. So, and let's take Purim as an example. We're going to do a lot of comparisons to Purim. So the theological one's pretty easy. We don't have to go over the theological and the moral components of Purim. We all know that. But let's look at the historical placement of Purim and what's so important about it in the history of the Jewish nation. What's important is that the Beis Hamikdash was. Let's run over the history. The Beis Hamikdash was started. They actually started building the Beis Hamikdash, and this should sound familiar. The local people in then Canaan or Palestine, whatever they called it then, were complaining. They were saying the settlers are stealing our land. Everything old is new again, or something like that, right? So the construction was shut down for 18 years, and that's when the Purim story happens. So something needed to restart that process, and what was restarted was that so the period of the Beis Hamikdash, the second Beis Hamikdash, started with Purim. All right, one second here. So now let's look at the historical component of Chanukah. So this is a little bit harder to detect for a number of reasons. Namely, because on one level, there was no lasting impact, at least in terms of a national historical view. Think about this. The Hashmonai dynasty was destroyed. The Maccabean dynasty was destroyed within a few generations. And a few generations after that, the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. We fell into a religious civil war, the Tzedukim against the Perushim. The Kohen Gadol, the office of the Kohen Gadol, was thoroughly corrupt. There's a basic halacha that the king can't be the priest, and the priest shouldn't be the king. The king is supposed to come from the tribe of Yehuda, and the priests are supposed to be Kohanim, who are from the tribe of Levi. They're descended from Aaron. And the Maccabees, who were Kohanim, set themselves up as kings. So it was, and then of course, the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. So what are we celebrating then for Chanukah? And the short answer is the intellectual imprint of Chanukah, and that's really what the whole rest of this year is about. But we need to look deeper. We need to look deeper at that. So let me bring up my my source document again, if I can find it. Here we go. I find this to be a really fascinating passage in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says from Atzeres until the festival. If you look in the Hebrew, Atzeres v'ad hachag. In the Mishnah, Atzeres doesn't mean Shmini Atzeres. What it means is Atzeres means Shavuos, and also in the Mishnah, Chag means Sukkos. Okay, so the mitzvah of Bikurim is when you have your first fruits. When you have your first fruits, you need to tie them off with a string and mark them, and then when they're ripe, you pick them, and then you bring them to you bring them to the temple. That's what it says here. He brings and recites. So he recites a whole passage, and we are all familiar with that passage. The passage starts off with "My father was an Aramean." It's a whole discussion. Why do you recite that passage? That's the same that is the exact passage that we recite and darshan in the Haggadah. My father was an Aramean, and tried to destroy me. Lavan tried to destroy me, etc. So that's when you're supposed to bring your first fruits between Shavuos and Sukkot. And then it says from Sukkot until Chanukah time, you still bring the fruits, but you have until Chanukah. Between Sukkot and Chanukah, you can still bring the fruits. And then there's a debate over whether you still should recite this bracha or recite this passage or not. So what's very interesting about this here is that, is this the page I'm supposed to be on? Yeah, no, that's all right. All right. What's really interesting about this passage is that you have a Torah mitzvah here, and the dates defining where that Torah mitzvah is, or when you're supposed to do it, are related to Chanukah. This is one of the very few places that Chanukah is mentioned in the oral Torah. All right, we will come back to that. I'm just laying down all the groundwork here. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is hints to the holidays that are in the Torah. Torah is timeless, and therefore anything that is very important to the development, or anything that is very important to the existence of our religious practice, is theoretically supposed to be found somewhere in the Torah. There's a hint to everything that's important to us in the Torah. So I want to read what it says about Purim here. So this is from the Gemara. From where in the Torah can we find an allusion to the hanging of Haman? And the verse states, I'm going to look in the Hebrew here, in Bereshis, it says, Hamin ha'etz, which is when Hashem is asking Chava, did you eat from the tree? So Hamin ha'etz, you can say Hamin is really Haman. Now, that seems like a cute wordplay, but actually there's actually a very deep message there. And it occurs to me maybe that will be the subject of my Purim drash. We'll think about it. Okay. So the Chulin continues. From where in the Torah can we find allusion to the events involving Esther? And I'm sure we've all heard this one. I will hide my face. Haster Esther comes from a pasuk, and we all know about that one. Right? We know the whole idea. One of the whole messages of Purim is that Hashem's face is hidden, right? And Hashem is working behind the scenes. Hashem's name is never mentioned, right, in the book of Esther. We all know that stuff. So this is a hint to that. And also the words Megillat Esther means to reveal the hidden. And that's exactly what Purim's about. So that's actually a very important allusion to Purim in the Torah. Where in the Torah can we find an allusion to Mordechai? One of the 13 ingredients of the Ketoris, we say it in davening every morning, for people that do the whole thing in the morning, we list off all the ingredients, and one of them is more. So the Gemara tells us that more doror in Aramaic is mira dachya, which resembles the name Mordechai. Okay. All right. So what about Chanukah? Now, actually, this gets to be more closely related to our subject here. I want to talk about Parshas Amor. So Parshas Amor is actually, I read a place that there's. I read something just the other day that said there's one hint to Chanukah in the Torah. And I know of two of them. So one of them is a small hint, and that is that the 25th word in the Torah is the word or, which means light. But that's not the big hint. The big hint is here. We know that there are three, the Torah lists all the holidays three times. So in Parshas Amor, which I'm about to go into, I'll just list all three times here. So in Parshas Amor, it lists all the days, the dates of the holidays, as well as the main mitzvahs of the holidays. So in Parshas Amor is where you read of Shofar and Lulav and Sukkah, and it defines all the mitzvahs of all the holidays. And we actually read Amor four times a year. We read it on the first 2 days of Sukkot, we read it on the second day of Pesach, and we read it when it comes around, usually. So I'm very familiar with that one because that was my son's bar mitzvah parsha. In Parshas Re'eh, it's also read, and in Parshas Re'eh, it focuses, the focus of that list of the holidays on the agricultural element. And then in Parshas Pinchas, which many of us know, because in Pinchas, it's all about the korbanos, and we take the passage that describes that particular holiday in Pinchas and what the korbanos are, and we actually add that into our Musaf davening. The whole reason why we have Musaf davening on Rosh Chodesh and the Yomim Tovim are because we add, Musaf means additional, we have these additional sacrifices, and that all comes from Pinchas. Okay, so let's look at what it says about Chanukah in Parshas Amor. So, of course, the answer is it doesn't say anything about Chanukah because the Torah came before. But let's take a look at this passage. So this is where Vayikra chapter 23, it starts off, it first talks about Shabbos, the first three verses, and then it starts talking about the months or the holidays in the order of the months as they usually are in the Torah. As we know in the Torah, the first month is Nisan, and it goes through. So it goes through all the holidays, right? So in this first part, the first thing is it talks about Pesach on the 15th day, and you sheet matzah, etc., etc. Then I'll skip a whole lot of verses. And then the last one, it says on the 15th day, the 7th month, right? When you've gathered in the field, so this is Sukkot. And then it says here, it goes all the way to Shmini Atzeres. On the 8th day, a complete rest on the 8th day. That's Uvayom Hashmini on the 8th day. That's Shmini Atzeres. And then the section closes very nicely. It says, V'edaber Moshe el Moedeh Hashem. By the way, that's an important. All these are called Moedim. These are appointed times with Hashem, and it's a nice closing to that section. It declared to Bnei Yisrael the set times of Hashem. Good. So we're all done with all the holidays. What's interesting is the next chapter of as we continue along. This is also in Amor. We see the next chapter, we get back to what most of Leviticus is about, right? Mitzvahs about the temple. But look what it says. So, V'yedaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, command Bnei Israel to bring you oil from olives for lighting. And you should light the lamps regularly. And then even on verse 4, you should set up the lamps of pure menorah, of pure oil in the menorah, right? Right here. In the menorah, Baal HaMenorah. So this is obviously, well, as we see here, if you look in the Midrash is trying to explain this passage. Why is it said you should take for yourselves oil in the section of the holidays in order to teach you that in the future there'll be a new Yontif and what involving oil, and what is that? It is Chanukah. Okay, fine, except we have some problems with that. They're a little bit subtle, but let me talk about these problems. The first problem is that we already have a section describing the menorah and what you're supposed to do with it. That's in Parshas Behalosecha. In fact, that's Behalosecha means when you go up Um, and it means when you go up on the ladder to light the menorah, is how that first word is interpreted. I mean, so that's all about the menorah. And um, it's out of place in that respect. It should belong with the other section of when we already described the menorah. The other thing is that um, it's out of place in another sense. Vayikra, the whole Sefer Vayikra is, which seems like it has a gazillion different random parts to it, and all kinds of laws are mentioned. Most of it actually follows a logical order. So and the order are mitzvahs as they radiate out from the middle of the Beis Hamikdash. So the first six, I think, or so chapters, the whole first parshas of Vayikra are all about the sacrifices, because the sacrifices are brought on the Mizbeach. And then it talks about the machane, the camp, which is sort of the outer parts of the Beis Hamikdash. And then the mitzvahs about the Kohanim that surround the machane. And then the Kedusha of everybody else. So so to talk about the menorah suddenly here is pretty out of place. And if you're going to talk about it here, then why does it come after what seems like a perfect ending pasuk here? So Moshe declared, right? This is like the ending pasuk to all the holidays. So why isn't this stuff over here, if it's a hint to the holidays, why doesn't it come beforehand? All right. We're still setting stuff up here. So it's going to seem, this whole thing is going to seem a little bit random, and we're going to tie it all together next week. I want to bring another section of Gemara here that finally talks about the two rabbinic holidays together, Purim and Chanukah. The Gemara says, is discussing the first pasuk of Tehillim of chapter 22. And the first pasuk says, Lamnatseach al ayelet hashachar. And this is, let's see, this English translation here says, for the conductor about the morning hind. So I'm not the most proficient in English, apparently. I had never heard of the word hind before. I wanted to leave it the way it is. So if you look in the Hebrew is ayelet, and I figured that was a female ayil. An ayil is a ram, which is a male sheep. I figured an ayelet probably means a female sheep. We already have a word for female sheep. So apparently a hind is a specific type of female deer. So then you're going to ask, well, wait a minute. Julie Andrews taught us all that the doe is a female deer. So I looked that up, and apparently a special type of red deer, the female is called a hind, and for all other deer, the female is called a doe. So there's your English word for today, if you wanted that. What's more important is the second verse. Well, both verses, all the verses are important, of course, right? The second verse is when Esther says, Kaylee, Kaylee, why have you forsaken me? And this is allegedly, supposedly taken place when Esther is walking down the hallway about to talk to King Ahasuerus uninvited, and she doesn't feel very good about herself. Things are not, doesn't seem to be going well, don't seem to be going well. So she thinks that Hashem has forsaken her, and she's reciting, according to tradition, she's reciting this Kapitel of Tehillim 22. And in fact, the Sephardim add that Kapitel of Tehillim into their davening on Purim morning. But let's go back to this passage here. So the Gemara wants to discuss what's so important, or what does this verse mean? for the conductor about the mourning hind. So it says, just as the antlers of a hind branch out, so here the light of dawn diffuses there. Here we go. I wrote it out. The Gemara says Queen Esther recited this Kapitel of Tehillim as she was about to come before King Achashverosh. So then the Gemara wants to look at, well, what does it mean, mourning hind? So it talks about hind, which I'm going to skip over here, and then it says, okay, but why mourning? And this is actually going to be pretty key here. Why was Esther likened to the dawn? It's to tell you that just as the dawn is the conclusion of the night, so too Esther, meaning the events of Purim, were the conclusion of all the miracles performed for the entire Jewish people. And then the Gemara asks the obvious question, wait a minute, what about the miracle of Chanukah? So then the Gemara says, well, what we mean to say is that Purim was the last miracle allowed to be written. And this actually is the beginning of a hint to what all our answers are going to be. I think I'm going to run about 5 minutes over, or 5 more minutes. I hope that's okay with everybody, because I want to get to one more passage. So what the hint here, if you look for what is the meaning of Hanukkah, and you go beyond the basics like we do, one of the things you're going to say is that Hanukkah is the holiday of Torah Shebaal Peh. Where do you get that from? Well, this is one of the places where you get that idea from, because Purim was the last miracle allowed to be written. We have Megillas Esther, but we don't have anything written about Hanukkah in our Tanakh. And that's what this is a slight allusion to. That Hanukkah is mostly in the oral law, not in the written part of Tanakh. All right, one last passage that seems really confusing, and we'll end on this cliffhanger here. This is from Midrash Pesikta Rabati, and some of you might recognize this pasuk here. It starts off, where is here we go, right at the beginning. Magadlu Masecha Hashem. This is a passage we recite, I think, in 2 different places in our davening. I think one of them is as part of the brachas for morning Shema. Magadlu Masecha Hashem. How great are your works, Hashem? I remember. Actually, Sandy, you were there. I remember once there was this huge snowstorm in Fairfax, like 18 inches of snow. And we were able to get a minyan on Shabbos. And because there were only 15 of us or so, Rabbi Deitch was able to go off script. And he just opened, I'm not sure at what point in services, but he just opened up for a discussion. He said, all right, we have this huge snowstorm. What is this telling us? And he asked for people's thoughts on what it meant about the snowstorm. So my own thought was this passage right here. Magadlu Masach Hashem. How great are the works of Hashem. Here we are. I mean, snowflakes are pretty small. And so we have like a bunch of these little snowflakes, and it's shutting down the entire East Coast. How great are your works, Hashem. We are so puny that we can't even stand up to little snowflakes. So the Gemara wants to interpret it. So the Gemara is saying, you know how great this passage is, Magadlu Hashem? Let me tell you something that is so amazing about Hashem. So if I were to ask you, all right, if you haven't already read it, if I asked you, what's the greatest thing about Hashem? Well, sunsets, the earth, creation. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to work with here, a lot of great things. So what does this Midrash say? Look what it says. Rabbi Chanina said, this is how great Hashem is. On the 25th of Kislev, the work was finished for the Mishkan, and he folded up until the 1st of Nisan. Okay, so we need a little bit background here. We have the sin of the golden calf, and Moshe Rabbeinu keeps going up to Har Sinai. He needs to get the second set of tablets. We get all the instructions on building the Mishkan, and finally, on the 10th of Tishrei and Yom Kippur, he comes down and he says the famous words, Salach, Salach Lanu, Hashem has forgiven us. Or Hashem said, Salachti, I forgive you. And within a couple days, the work around Sukkot's time, the work begins on building the Mishkan for the very first time. And according to tradition, it worked. They worked on it for 3 months, and on the 25th of Kislev, they finished. So here we have yet another hint to Chanukah, right? Chanukah is called the dedication of lights. Actually, it could have been the dedication of the Mishkan, because the Mishkan was finished on the 25th of Kislev. And what does Hashem do? Hashem says, okay, good, I'm glad you're finished. Now fold it up. We're not going to use it until Nisan. So the whole time, as I'm just reading from the Midrash here, so the whole time was folded up. Yisrael was sort of complaining against Hashem, saying, against Moshe, saying, why did we spend 3 months building this thing just so that you can put it in storage? Maybe we didn't do it right. And the answer was no. Hashem wanted to mix the simcha of the Mishkan with the month that Yitzchak was born. So again, I'll ask you another question. Why, if you had to refer to the month of Nisan, how would you refer to that month? Oh, yeah, I'm going to wait till the first of the months. I'm going to wait till the month where Pesach, Yetzias Mitzrayim happened. I'm going to wait till the month, we celebrate Pesach. Here it says, now we're going to wait till the month that Yitzchak was born. Okay, that's kind of weird. So now Kislev is lost out, right? Kislev was had the month where the Mishkan was finished. Kislev lost out because that's when the work was done. And this little passage of the Midrash concludes, Hashem said, I will repay him. And how will I repay him? With the dedication. Chanukah comes from the shorish, the same shorish as the word dedication. The dedication of the house of the Chashmonai. That's how I will repay him. So that's a weird passage. I still think the greatest thing Hashem did was create the universe. And they're talking about, months. Kislev and Nisan are complaining about each other. I should get the dedication of the Mishkan, and and it appears Chanukah gets a little bit of short shrift here, and they're arguing about who gets to host the induction ceremony. So this really begins the crux of the discussion of what's so important about Chanukah, and why, as I noted in the promotional materials, I said that the S'fas Emes said that Chanukah is the key to the survival of the Jewish people for 2,000 years. So this whole thing makes sense when we take a look at this whole historical background of Chanukah in the larger context when we just did. And that is going to end the first session. That is the cliffhanger I'm going to end on. Let me hit stop on the recording.